Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Makdisi Street podcast. We're delighted today to be joined by our cousin, Wadie Said, who is professor of law and Dean's faculty fellow at the University of Colorado School of Law. Wadie is the author of a book on federal terrorism prosecution, as well as many law review articles and book chapters on the intersection of criminal law, international law, and the construct, the discourse really around terrorism. He's also a former assistant public defender, and member of the American Law Institute. And as I said earlier, he is our cousin, which means in effect that he is basically our fourth brother. So for those of you who follow the show, who often comment that you like the wrap-up segment with the three of us at the end, well, you're going to have four of us this time, in effect. So, Wadie, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Mabruk on the podcast. I know it's been a great success the world over, so I'm honored to be here.
Inshallah. Thank you. I guess, Wadie, we might as well begin. This is going to be, it's going to end up being, I think, a free-flowing conversation, but why don't we begin with the present? Why don't we begin with the dystopian present that we find ourselves in, and with the return of Donald Trump to the White House? What do you have? Initial thoughts, feelings, ideas, reactions?
Well, I mean, wow.
It's a big one, I know.
I mean, dystopian is a word that everyone keeps using, but I mean, I think it's appropriate in this context. What struck me the most, honestly, was yesterday when he was inaugurated by the Chief Justice of the United States, who I'm not a big fan of in terms of his jurisprudence, but still, I'm used to the office being given its kind of full weight and gravitas. So, Trump is sworn in as president for the second time, hand on the Bible. Then he shakes the Chief Justice's hand, and then he says something to him, and then he gives him a six gun. Hey, this is, he's, he's in the casino greeting patrons. So already, it's a different world we've re-entered, you could say. I mean, because everyone is looking at the negative and all these, and I'm personally kind of stunned because already, Obama was the deporter in chief. He broke the record for deportations. And then Trump came along and, numbers wise, I don't think the differences were so great, but the cruelty, the kids in the cages and the separating families thing, and the rhetoric was really ugly because he has a particular advisor a couple of advisors who are really, really kind of anti-immigration. So I'm stunned now because also the Biden administration was bad on deportations as well. They were not good or friendly to immigrants either. As it's been reported, the southern border is as quiet as it's ever been, during the Biden administration, the former Biden administration, thankfully. But now what do we see? We see the rhetoric about illegal immigration, which really shocks me because the country doesn't work without all these non-citizens coming here. And so I'm a little bit in shock that this is the agenda and this is somehow going to make the country great again. There's a real discord there, just in terms of that particular policy. May be positive, in addition to the ceasefire in Gaza, is the fact that one of the things Trump said is there's not going to be any more war. We're not going to get any more wars. We're not going to support any more wars, which, I was thinking about it. I was thinking about it yesterday. If the last term featured people that Trump appointed who are, say, 100% anti-Palestinian, pro-Israeli right wing. This term, it's more like maybe 80-20 or 90-10. There are a couple of names in there where they're isolationists, the whole sort of Tucker Carlson wing of the Republican Party, this idea that, of the right, the MAGA movement, who really don't want to be supporting foreign nations. They don't really like us. It's not like they think we're great people. They still think we're savages, but they don't want to, be giving out money to foreign countries. And oh, by the way, that includes the Israeli state as well. So maybe there are some signs that it's not all bad. Although my particular my particular one that always gets me is why they want to open up drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. That's the one that doesn't make any sense.
Well, yeah, just a question. Trump, did this big performance after the inauguration and signed, 70 or whatever executive orders. Can you just legally explain? Because the U.S. seems to have become just a series of executive orders. Can you explain what exactly that is? Is there legal? Are those legal things? What is the connection? And are there particular executive orders that you saw that we should just even generally be particularly focused on? I know he's beginning the process to get out the WHO, the World Health Organization, and just I think left the Paris or is beginning to get out the Paris climate change. So can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes. So basically, if Congress makes the law, the executive branch has the power in the form of the president issuing executive orders to issue policy for how they're going to implement the law. So that's what an executive order is. So basically, when they sign that, they're basically saying, look, this is how we interpret the law and this is how we are going to interpret the law in this administration. So that's what he's doing. So a couple are, generally speaking, there isn't supposed to be a contradiction between the law and the executive order, which is just an enactment of policy. But clearly, there are a couple here that are provocative / unconstitutional. Like, for example, he signed an executive order making birthright citizenship illegal. That's the subject of a Supreme Court decision. That's a constitutional matter. I don't think you can get rid of that with an executive order. I was trying to get in touch with a colleague of mine at Colorado, even though I used to teach immigration law. He teaches it at Colorado, and I used to teach it at South Carolina. I don't anymore. But this is a colleague of mine who's, published much, much more in this area than I have. And, he's like, well, we'll have to talk about it when you get back. I don't see it, but that one is a real kind of, okay, we're going beyond a declaration of policy to, trying to rewrite the law via the executive order pen as opposed to going through Congress. It's also a statement on the fact that Congress very rarely gets anything done. And so in recent years, what we've seen, it really took off. I mean, I think I think presidents have always used executive orders, but it really took off when I think in the George W. Bush post 9/11 era, where his administration really started operating by executive order because Congress was seen as kind of polarized. A positive example of an executive order is I think Jimmy Carter signed an executive order saying, the CIA can't engage in assassinations. Right. So that's generally what's going on is there's this the president the president has this power or seen to have this power. And of course, recent Republican administrations believe that the president's power is kind of even greater than traditionally believed. This is the so-called unitary executive theory. So they've been operating by executive order in more areas maybe than they should or than they legitimately can, a lot due to Congress's paralysis.
Just one other question, just to frame this larger discussion that I think we're going to be having soon. This relationship between the president or the executive orders and the Congress. Can you just set up how this is the question of declaring war or everything sort of below that, the idea of the drone strikes that Obama used to do a lot of, the setting up of secret missions in Syria, all this kinds of stuff. What is it, or if the US decides it wants to help the Israelis attack Iran, what is it? What is that relationship? Just so we can understand who the main players are and the extent to the presidential powers. Is it a presidential system now?
Yeah, well, I mean, we know via the War Powers Act that Congress is supposed to be declaring war, but these are all measures that have been kind of, you could even use the phrase like legally gerrymandered to be construed as not declaring war, right? And that's, I think, what you're seeing is think about it from, this is a point probably that applies in so many contexts that we could talk about. But think about, you go to school and then you study and then, college and you get your higher degrees and, you're taught about the value of evidence and accuracy and making arguments and stuff. And then you see the government coming in and just completely turning the meaning of words, the meaning of concepts on their head for purposes that, in most instances are nefarious purposes, right? Which is not just a character in Asterix. And so, we have to think about how this continues to happen.
Well, to come back to something you said, you touched on earlier about Trump and sort of, there's a strong strand on the American right, sort of an isolationist strand, which in a way runs against the whole impetus of American empire building, in all kinds of ways, actually. I think Trump, to me, it seems like the guy doesn't really have an ideological commitment, left, right, or center, or anything. I think his main commitment is to himself and I think he would go whichever way, as long as it served his purposes and built up his ego and his sense of self and maybe enriched him a little bit more and so on and so forth. So I think that, we're going to transition to our part of the world in a minute, but just a thought on whether, the Israelis seem to be convinced that he's their guy, that they can pull him and push him and twist him the way they have other American presidents, most obviously Biden recently. But do you think that's true about Trump, or do you think, in fact, this could go very, very badly? It's not necessarily going to go very well for us, but do you think it could also blow up in the face of Netanyahu? Because Trump doesn't like people second guessing him. He doesn't like people undermining him. He doesn't like losers. There's all this kind of stuff going on in his own psychology, basically. What do you think about that?
I think that's a really strong theory. I think there's really something to that critique. I don't think that that's nothing. You would think that when talking about the office of the President of the United States, that we wouldn't be talking about personal characteristics as the main driving factor. But yeah, I think you're you're onto something. And I think in this instance in particular, right, business interests, personality. Remember, the first Trump term was a complete washout from our perspective, right? But then the elections fiasco occurred and Netanyahu congratulated Biden. Trump got upset. He doesn't forget stuff like that. It seems to be part of his personality, that he remembers when people slight him or go against him, and he comes back to them. Now, the sheer number of business interests, so when you saw that he said Nikki Haley's not going to be in this administration, Pompeo's not going to be in this administration, and then he appoints Marco Rubio and his national security advisors, whatever, and the defense secretary appointee are all, they're all really, and the Mike Huckabee as ambassador to our occupied homeland, not our homeland, obviously then we started thinking, well, maybe that's just a kind of superficial critique. But then, I think there's a guy he appointed as Undersecretary of State for Defense Policy who's an isolationist. There's the whole, like we were talking about earlier, the Tucker Carlson wing. There are more, hate to use these kind of terms, but because it's not a game, but there are more wild cards at play in this. So I think personality, he has this Lebanese, connection now via his daughter with Marla Maples. There are more variables out there. That's what I was talking about earlier when I said, 80-20 or 90-10 aligned against us, as opposed to last time where it was just 100%. And David Friedman, this kind of absurd bankruptcy lawyer from New York, is now the ambassador, and he's kind of de facto making policy, which is annex the West Bank and make it part of the greater Israeli project, it doesn't seem quite the same. And the levels of personality and history maybe change things.
Well, yeah, but on that note, it may not be the same, you say, but the last time Trump, between the first administration and this new administration, there, of course, has been the genocide in Gaza. And so I'm wondering, we're now recording a few days after the ceasefire in Gaza, although, of course, the Israelis keep killing people in the West Bank, even in Gaza. What are your thoughts? Do you really think this 90-10 or 80-20, as you described it, will make a difference? I mean, so first, your thoughts on the ceasefire, just generally speaking, and then more specifically, to follow up on what you said, do you think really that a Trump administration's 90-10 or 80-20, as you put it, will make a difference for our people?
Yeah, so first of all, I have to say, and I think many have articulated this already, the immense relief that I feel for the people of the Gaza Strip is kind of overwhelming. Just the sheer amount of suffering that they've had to endure is beyond my comprehension. I mean, it's beyond anything. I've been to Gaza 4 times, right? And each time I've been struck at, that it is a refugee settlement, really. And it's poor. It's, you feel that you're stuck when you're in there. You can sense that things don't work normally. It's 2025 and that people still, before October 7th, but this is true now, people, get around by donkey cart in certain areas. Like, it's a different world, but the people are really remarkable there and so friendly and so welcoming. And also, as we've learned, so incredibly committed to their nation, to their nationality, to their land, which is incredibly, it's beyond anything, and this is a positive thing, it's beyond any type of commitment I can reasonably articulate, that they would stay, these constant orders, leave here, it's not safe, leave, we're going to clear the north, the Israelis constantly, we're going to do this, and then they would act on their policy and people would still stay. Obviously, I'm sure we'll talk about resistance in a little bit, but just the statement of the people of Gaza to the world is something that's, incredibly inspiring and incredibly moving. So just in the immediate period right now, very narrow time period, there's this great sense of relief. As far as what the Trump administration will be doing with or without, or with respect to Palestine or not, obviously the signs don't look great. Even if we highlight, kind of little rays of hope. On the other hand, we have to say just the commitment to not being at war, the failure of the Israeli military machine to achieve its goals. Sari was talking earlier about Trump not liking losers, and that, there can be all sorts of spinning about how the Israelis didn't lose or they've, had their hands tied. One of the more absurd statements I can imagine. But just going with that type of, propagandistic line, I don't think I don't think that there's much of an appetite for more of this. And I think just as a general matter, I think there are real ways in which the Israelis are boxed in. And, I'm really hopeful that there won't be a return to war. Obviously, we all worry about it. These are names and these are people who have stated very alarming things. I think one of the things that when we were talking about earlier, when Karim was talking about the executive orders, one of the ones that was alarming was the lifting the sanctions on the various settler movements, right? So, obviously there's an element of horse trading or interest groups that are represented in this new administration that are, allied against us. So I think we're constantly going to be dealing with multiple lines of information or multiple concentrations of interest that aren't necessarily always in alignment.
But on this point, I mean, we on this podcast have often debated and discussed this question. Is, for example, the Biden administration, when it comes to Gaza, obviously it was a horror show. I mean, it was just absolutely outrageous and depraved beyond belief, beyond any of our imaginations. And yet the liberal discourse was always, at least at elements at times, I wish they would say, we wish that not so many Palestinians were being killed, etc., even as they were arming the Israelis to the teeth. Do you think that this kind of new administration, this kind of right-wing, sort of explicitly, I should say, right-wing, anti-immigrant, sort of overtly anti-CRT, anti-all that stuff, will make a... Do you think that the rhetoric, in other words, makes a difference? I mean, from your perspective, both as a professor of law, but also as a person, as a Palestinian, as someone who is followed and is deeply sort of connected to what is going on, do you think that the change of administration fundamentally makes a difference? The rhetoric I'm talking about, in terms of the rhetoric, in terms of the way, the cruelty, the overt cruelty, as opposed to the overt, I guess, racist neglect of mentioning Palestinians.
Yes, and this is also the first Trump administration gave us the so-called Muslim ban as well, upheld 5-4 by the United States Supreme Court in a decision that I still find shocking, even though I wasn't really shocked given the makeup of the court. But I think on this point, it's interesting because I spent a lot of time in Palestine and the greater Middle East in the period of the last half of the 90s, early 2000s. And I remember, and that was the so-called peace process era. And I remember a lot of the discourse would be, among Palestinians or people who were pro-Palestinian, let's get rid of the labor governments, the labor Israeli governments that, pretend to be talking about peace. And, the Likud is better because at that time, that was when Netanyahu defeated Peres in the spring of 1996, after Peres launched yet another horrific war on Lebanon, so-called the Operation Grapes of Wrath, he called it, featuring the Qana massacre, the first Qana massacre, as you all remember very well. But basically, there was a thinking, because the peace process rhetoric was so smarmy and so meant to be inclusive while also being exclusive and favoring the Israelis. There was an element of, let's get rid of all these smoke screens and face Zionism directly. And then Netanyahu would come and, build a tunnel under Al-Aqsa and start a whole new series of settlements in Jabal Abu Ghneim or whatever it was. And then and then the policy would also get worse. Like, if you were trying to go visit Palestine, it would become much harder. The border, the procedures at the border would be much more intrusive up until, in the early 2000s after the second Intifada, where, you had the Sharon government, and I wasn't allowed to go in twice. I was denied entry twice. It got so suspicious and so hostile. So, I sort of was thinking, okay, maybe, this labor Likud thing is overplayed. Now I think the Democrats actually showed in some ways that with, I think if we were traditional Republicans taken over, with the AIPAC kind of concentration in Congress, plus the Christian Zionist thing, I think the Republicans would be far, far worse. I think what the MAGA movement brings, right, in addition to self-aggrandizement and self-enrichment and, double standards for itself, it also brings a hostility to the other. And what we're seeing is there is the potential for the other to include the Israelis. So what I think we saw with the Biden administration that was completely shocking, and the kind of, I think, Osama, you talked about this as, the sort of the death of liberalism, the death of Western liberalism in multiple contexts. is, you had a guy. I'll give an example here, and it's I don't often do this, but just I think this one I think it's fair to bring it up. I went to law school with a guy called Brett McGurk, who I'm sure you've heard of. He was in my first year section, and I knew him only very, kind of superficially, friendly with him in a, kind of, oh, hey, how you doing type of way. But Brett McGurk was in my law school class. I guarantee you, if you put a newspaper in Arabic and a newspaper in Hebrew in front of him at that time, he would have had no idea which was which. He would have had no idea about the countries of the Middle East. He was a smart guy. He was a very ambitious guy, very ambitious. But he didn't strike me as anyone who knew the first thing about the Middle East. Fast forward to, whatever it is, nearly 30 years later, 27, 28, 29 years later, he's the guy dealing with the Palestine file in the Biden administration. And what we learned through newspaper reports is allegedly he was a big proponent of continuing to just give the Israelis whatever they wanted, which is shocking to me. And he also, his background is as the kind of the big ISIS fighter. And the reason why he will definitely not survive into this Trump regime is because he famously survived into the Trump regime he was in the George W. Bush, the Coalition Provisional Authority, then he was in, then he was in the Obama administration as kind of special coordinator for ISIS. And then he survived in that capacity to Trump. And then he famously said, this is a corrupt regime. I'm getting out of it. The Trump regime is corrupt. And he left. So we know he's not coming back. But it's shocking to me that we live in a country where you have people like that. These are, I guess, the proverbial, the Vietnam era, best and the brightest. Very smart guy, very sharp guy. But my goodness, what a horrendous record with respect to our people. What incredible hostility. Where is this hostility coming from? So all in service of policy goals that he feels, Palestinians, raising arms against Israelis thwarted for him. So I'm a little bit, so in that respect, given the fact that our people have just faced a genocide and there's no guarantee that it won't start back up again, just to get some relief from that constant gaslighting and smarmy liberal language and consistently tell us, that up is down and black is white and what we're seeing is not genocide and all this complete garbage, and that, the what blew up the hospital was really an Islamic Jihad rocket and all of this, we could go on and on. Just to get a little bit of relief from that now is, I think, very welcome, even though it may not portend anything great for the future.
Well, yeah, and when I studied international law back in the day, things seemed to be relatively simple in the sense that you had the laws of war, you had the laws in war, the Geneva Conventions, international humanitarian law, and you'd say, okay, these are the laws that apply, and okay, double standards, you wouldn't do this, you wouldn't do that, and now there seems to be, as I seem to understand it, there seems to be some kind of transformation that's been happening. I think probably post September 11, 2001, the war on terror, and then the successive, both the Gaza wars and the Lebanon wars really on top of that, and other wars, but at least these are wars that I know and kind of track. I want to read out what the German foreign minister said and get your thoughts on this, because this is on the question of how does an anti-colonial movement, how does a resistance movement be able to grapple with law and say, okay, we're trying to fight for liberation, but of course there are also red lines as to what even the liberation movement can use in terms of violence, but there doesn't seem to be any wiggle room at all these days. So I just want to read out very quickly. She says, and she said it on more than one occasion. She said, self-defense means not only attacking terrorists, but destroying them. When Hamas terrorists hide behind people, behind schools, civilian places lose their protected status because terrorists abuse it. And so, and she goes on about basically this idea of the Israelis simply say, they can call out, say, The Hamas terrorists are sitting on top of all these civilians, and so therefore there is no such thing as civilians. And the Israelis said it a lot, but now you have the German foreign minister, and then I think some in the US also said the same. And it seems to be catching on that basically the old rule, as far as that I knew, and it was seemed to be the most basic rule, which is you can't hit civilians. Now that seems to be quite blurred, and not only blurred, but the Israelis or those who are doing the genocide, committing the massacres, are the ones who get to decide whether they're allowed to do it or not. Am I exaggerating this? Is there some kind of shift, or is this very, very exceptional? And then once this war ends, we go back to something else, a traditional humanitarian law kind of doctrine.
Yeah. So I think, unfortunately, your suspicions are well placed, right? I think so. First of all, just as an aside, the German foreign minister her statements, her positions, she's a member of the Green Party, after all, have been absolutely appalling. And I just, on a personal level, we frequently have to listen to leaders in high places condemn us while they, give the Israelis a pass. So I just want to go personally and say I condemn everything she says.
Me too. Please, for the record, on the record. I was trying to be very polite. But she is absolutely horrendous.
The Muqdisi Street podcast unreservedly condemns her.
Absolutely condemns.
It is absolutely outrageous that, she also lectures, you can see her lecturing about this and about how it's beyond appalling, the positions she's taken. And I don't understand. I mean, Germany's a whole other issue that we could, I'm sure, probably talk about in a whole podcast that would be maybe not safe for publication. But so I think the issue with international law is manifold, but it all tracks. I think you've hit on this issue of the post 9/11 shift has really supercharged the idea of us and them, or the idea of once you can apply a terrorism label to an opponent, that's it. It's over for them. And basically everything is allowed, and they're not allowed. They're not allowed to do anything in terms of firing back. So that's the American model, and I think I wrote an article about this in the UCLA Law Review, about how the UN terrorism system is largely based on the American kind of construct. And at the heart of it is this idea that the terrorist organization is so tainted by its terrorist, its terrorist classification that literally it can do nothing legitimate, nothing. That is to say, can't hand out, food to people in need, can't rebuild homes, can't do anything, let alone shoot at occupying military. And I think, when we talk about international law, the U.S. and many people have obviously talked about, well, in the United States, there's this great hostility to international institutions. The U.S. So what you saw was, and again, this goes back to this Democrat versus Republican, what Clinton did in his sort of last days in office was he famously signed the Rome Statute, the founding statute for the International Criminal Court. So when George W. Bush took office, this is before the 9/11 attacks, he famously unsigned Clinton signing on to the Rome Statute. Clinton signing on to the Rome Statute, by the way, was a completely empty act because he knew that the Senate, he'd never find 2/3 of senators to ratify the Rome Statute and, bring the United States into the International Criminal Court's orbit. So, but Bush really wanted to make the point, even though there was no realistic possibility the U.S. would would become a state party to the ICC. So that was not enough. After 9/11, there was a law passed, I think in 2002, called the American Service Members Protection Act, also known as the Hague Invasion Act, which allows the U.S. to use force if any of its personnel, including allied military personnel, countries allied to its military personnel, ever get brought to The Hague on charges before the ICC. They can use military force to extract them, hence the name Hague Invasion Act. And that mentality hasn't really gone, hasn't really left. What we've seen is the Democratic administrations, Obama 1 and 2 and Biden, basically just kind of use the International Criminal Court for their own political purposes. You know, Obama famously allowed the prosecution of Omar al-Bashir, the then president of Sudan. That was a kind of a compromise because it was done through the Security Council, versus the Bush 1, Bush 2, and now Trump 1 and Trump 2, complete and total hostility, right? I think in the Bush administration, there may have been, you know, some kind of signals that they would be okay with the ICC indicting Bashir before Obama took office. I think there may have been some, you know, for others, maybe it's okay, but the US, no. So there's this, you know, the Democrats, they don't want to sanction ICC personnel, but they also don't want to, you know, they also don't want to, you know, they also refuse to have, for the United States to have anything to do with the court. I mean, I think that's where we are. You know, in both instances, the U.S. is not going to deal with the ICC. And now we see, of course, the Trump administration bringing back.
Sorry, just to get you back to the question of self-defense, just because I'm trying to figure out the question of self-defense and what this German foreign minister. But again, I think others have said it. Other Western leaders have said it. And so the question of has legally speaking, I'm not saying politically like me sitting, I can say what I want, but legally speaking, has there been a shift in the way in which the legal profession, internationally, domestically, whatever it is, to say, yes, self-defense has now shifted? Because I remember after September 11, there was a lot of resistance to it, to what the Bush doctrine, to what the Americans were trying. There was pushback.
Oh, yes, you mean preemptive self-defense.
The preemptive self-defense, and I don't know, this is not just preemptive self-defense, right? This is we get to kill civilians. Isn't that that's a separate thing to whether we get to preempt?
Yeah, but also it's not against another state. And that's it, but which is the other thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, of course, there's the key provision that, you know, there is no right of a state to self-defense in occupied territory, obviously. But I think in a kind of a grander sense, what we're seeing is, and I mean, I wanted to talk just about the American background there, because I think it influences, you know, it puts the European states, particularly European states and Australia and Canada, you know, these countries that purport to care about these international institutions, all the while they use them for their own benefit, or, you know. But I think with respect to the issue of Palestinian self-defense, or, you know, anti-colonial self-defense, et cetera, what we've seen is there is no willingness. So international law has to have some kind of basic structure to it, despite its, you know, colonial origins and its European origins and its racist origins, et cetera. And we've seen there's been a third world approaches to international law movement, and, you know, many dissident voices talking about all the flaws in international law and how it can be repurposed or reused to be more inclusive and fair to all. And I think what we're seeing is the message from Washington and other assorted, you know, kind of Western capitals is, no, you know, this is not for you. I think there was an editorial in the Washington Post recently which said, look, the ICC, it wasn't made to try people like Netanyahu. That's not what it's for. Which, of course, is, well, doesn't it apply to the, you know, isn't it the International Criminal Court, not just the international for those who are, you know, unlucky enough to be of the darker races or of the poorer countries? So I think we've seen this profound crisis in international law. And then that's where we also get into this continuing drumbeat of, well, it's not enforceable. It's not enforceable. It's not binding, you know, and which I'm, you know better than I in these, Karim, in these international law, international relations discussions, is just a kind of a cop-out, because there's the principle and there's either the principle or there isn't. But what we're also seeing is the United States has had a consistent position, not just in the context of the Palestinian issue, but just as a general matter. And you see it in its counterterrorism law and policy as well. It does not recognize the right of a non-state actor to use violence in self-defense or against occupation as a blanket issue. If in the cases where it does, in the Afghani Mujahideen situation, Iraqi Kurds, whatever it is, that's a kind of a special exemption that the U.S., in its infinite imperial wisdom, grants these groups, but it doesn't recognize the principle. The U.S., because I remember when I was working on the Al Arian prosecution, and my client was, along with the other defendants in the case, charged with being part of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad movement and working on its behalf. And they were, by association, based on the nature of the conspiracy charges, on the hook for all the armed operations that the Palestinian Islamic Jihad had carried out in Palestine. And basically in that context, I tried to argue, well, look, the first additional protocol to the Geneva Convention allows occupied peoples to resist occupation. So at least in the West Bank and Gaza, they're allowed to shoot at soldiers. And the court just said, nope, because the government came in with a brief and said the U.S. government's never recognized this, and it's always rejected this part of the first, additional Geneva Protocol, first additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions of 1977. And as you, Karim, know better than I, right? International law is a lot of state practice. And the U.S. is the most powerful state, practicing the law in ways it wants and can throw its weight around. So that argument, despite the moral force of a right to self-defense and a right to resistance, has always been rejected. And I think that's what we saw also during the period of 15 plus months of genocide, is the United States just refuses to engage. Blinken, in his, a kind of farewell interviews as Secretary of State. Well, charges of genocide. No, it's not that. First of all, no, it's not that. Why? He's not going to tell us. Biden, before October 7th, in the summer of 2022, he said, people are trying to say that what's going on in the Middle East is apartheid, that what the Israelis are carrying out is apartheid. We're not going to call it that. Why? We don't have to say. But on this point, exactly on this point, so it sounds like you're saying that it's entirely up to the discretion of the U.S. government and U.S. executive to basically say whatever they want, and then they move with that. But the question is I've actually written articles about this.
No, I
know. Terrorism policy is terrorism. Literally, is what we say it is.
Exactly. So my question to you, for our audience, can you define or help, because you've written about this, and of course you've not just written about this, you're not just an expert on this in terms of being a professor of law, but you've also, as you indicated earlier, you've actually practiced as a federal public defender in courts, and you've seen this operation and how it works. What is the definition of terrorism? Is there a definition of terrorism that the U.S. government uses, other than saying, well, we decide what we want and we'll call this person or that organization? Is there an actual definition? And then what rights do people have? How does one deal? I know this is a huge question, but what is the definition? And then how does one sort of contest that? Or can one contest that? Or is it incontestable?
Well, then let me add the definition in the US, but also does that exist at the UN and sort of at the international level? Where are we in that discussion?
Okay, so starting maybe in the international level, there still is 2025 no internationally recognized definition of terrorism because of all the political minefields that defining the issue might kind of stir up.
What about the UN? You said the UN followed the US.
So the U.S. is yes. So the interesting thing, as a side note, there was a famous Italian jurist called Antonio Cassese who he was a big proponent of the idea that there is there is in customary international law a definition of terror. There is a customary international law crime of international terrorism. And he just happened to be a judge on the Court of Appeal, or on the appellate bench of the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, where he purported to find that there was, in fact, an international definition of terrorism, or there was an internationally agreed upon definition of terrorism as a violation of customary international law. It was a complete, that tribunal, as you all very well know, in addition to being a beachhead for, Israeli, American, British, French intelligence to kind of completely mine the Lebanese state for personal information, which may have also had an effect in the most recent war on Lebanon.
Definitely.
In addition to that, it was also used as a vehicle by Antonio Cassese, who's no longer with us. So I'll try not to speak too ill of the dead, because he was a big figure. Although on this issue, I, and not just I, other much more prominent figures in the international law realm have said this is complete farce. There's one guy who I think is currently the special rapporteur for maybe counterterrorism. I think that's what he is now. Ben Saul, he's a professor in the University of Sydney Law School. He wrote a very, thorough takedown of this decision by Cassese, saying, what is it? You come onto a court just to propagate your own, theories that are completely not based in law. So it still remains the case that there is no internationally agreed upon definition of terrorism. In the United States, there is a definition for legal purposes, because there are all these criminal and civil laws that deal with so-called international terrorism as opposed to domestic terrorism, which is another construct. But there is a definition of international terrorism, which basically involves, using violence against civilians for political purposes, just as a general.
Which basically means essentially every state. Certainly the U.S.
Well, so
it's a state or non-state?
It doesn't. I don't think. If I remember right, it doesn't. It just says what you just said. It's the use of violence for political, or the use of violence against civilians for political purposes. It's like,
well, the way the law
doesn't do that.
The issue with the state versus the non-state is, for the most part, that definition only deals with non-state actors. So there can be a context in which a state can be declared a state sponsor of terrorism, as we just saw. I think there are only two left, right? I think it's Syria and Iran, maybe. Or Syria, maybe Syria, Iran, North Korea. Syria, Iran, North Korea. What's it?
Venezuela, maybe too?
No, I don't think they put them. Maybe they'll put them back on there. But you saw that Biden administration famously in the last week took off Cuba from this list. But, we're talking North Korea, it's a very small number. And the purposes of having a state sponsor of terrorism means that they can be treated differently. They don't enjoy the traditional provisions of state sovereignty, right, which allows them to be sued. So, for example, in the case of, you remember the famous hostages cases from the Lebanese Civil War, Iran being declared a state sponsor of terror allowed all the former American hostages to sue Iran in federal court. And of course, the Iranian authorities, they don't have diplomatic relations. They didn't appear, so they defaulted. So the United States had a bunch of money that they've been holding. They have a bunch of Iranian assets that have been accumulated in different ways over the decades, and they would award some of that money to these, to the victims of whatever it was, kidnappings in Lebanon, or et cetera, or people would claim to be survivors of an attack that they claimed was sponsored by the government of Iran. They would then sue and obtain a default judgment. And this persists to this day because Iran is considered by the United States to be a state sponsor of terror. But that's a very, very narrow group of states. We're talking about 2 or 3. Non-state actors are the kind of de facto model for a terrorist organization and for terrorism itself.
By the way, Wadie, I can't remember if we've had this conversation, but I was reminding my brothers earlier that the definition. When the word entered the English language? This is always a matter of curiosity to me. Do you know this?
Yes, I think I heard you say this before. This is The French Revolution,
in
right?
the 1790s, in the Romantic periods, in the 1790s, and it was
Right,
specifically
Robespierre, the terror.
Yeah, exactly. So a terrorist was somebody who supported Robespierre's terror. That's what a terrorist. That was the original definition of terrorist. Terrorism then was state violence of the sort used by Robespierre in the terror. So in other words, terrorism. The original definition in the English language referred to state violence against its own civilians, basically.
Against opponents, political opponents. But just to get us back to, I mean, that's actually fascinating. This history is actually fascinating. But to get back to this question that was raised, how does somebody get designated a foreign terrorist organization? I mean, you say there is a handful of states that are described as state sponsors of terrorism. But is it just is it the Secretary of State who just decides, well, I'm going to say this person is this, and that's it? There's no recourse. There's no appeal. There's no. Is there any judicial process?
What happened with Julian Osama recently, right? Because he was a terrorist, and now he's suddenly not a terrorist all of a sudden.
So that's different.
This is this is a different thing. I mean, Giuliani as an individual versus the state. These are different things. Just for the record, it says here, as of 2025, it's Cuba, Iran, North Korea, and Syria. Trump has reinstated Cuba. So those are the four.
Poor Cubans. What did they? Sometimes just having a revolution is, it's really the Cuban thing is really, it certainly makes you think about the depths of hostility that individuals or countries can harbor towards another. That is not. Anyway, let's not dwell on this too much. Okay, so there's two kind of purpose. There's two kind of, I think, classifications to think about. One is legal classification for the purposes of prosecuting people, so a kind of a more criminal law construct, and then the other is more of just a kind of a policy. So just as a general matter, a country can say whoever it wants is a terrorist, etc. The question is, what does it do about it? So, because the United States, you remember very well the 1970s and 1980s, this idea that the PLO was a terrorist organization, and Yasser Arafat was Hitler, and et cetera. And, the PLO would try to say, look, we're doing what you want. We're obeying the ceasefire in Lebanon. We're not attacking civilians. We're not, and doing favors to American intelligence and, cultivating relationships with American, intelligence officials. And, that would all mean nothing, right? That would all mean nothing. Sort of a policy versus what we've seen in the United States, which is, I think, and this is when I talked about this earlier, about how the UN has kind of embraced a lot of this logic. Not entirely, but the United States has engaged in a legal innovation starting in the mid-90s that I think has been a profound and profoundly negative development for the purposes of how Palestinian resistance, Lebanese resistance to the Israelis is perceived. Okay. I mean, it's not just limited to our context, but it is very, very, very negative in our particular context. So basically, and it's a longer history. So I don't know, should I talk about it? Because it might take a little bit of time. Just this whole criminalizing construct. Is that okay? Okay. So basically, as a result of violence in the Middle East, let's put it in the most anodyne terms, which I think really started with the Baruch Goldstein attack of February 1994, right? When Baruch Goldstein, this Kahanist settler, attacks the Ibrahimi mosque and kills, 29 or something Palestinians while they're praying. Right. After that, we see that the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas, decides that it's going to bring in to the conflict the what it calls the martyrdom operation, what's called in the West the suicide operation. And all of a sudden, there are these attacks. So that's wreaking havoc with the Bill Clinton-led peace process. So in January, so after an attack by the Islamic Jihad movement in Palestine on an Israeli bus, where they killed however many people in January of 1995, Clinton issues an executive order basically designating as opponents to the peace process a whole number of individuals and groups. So over the next year plus, a couple of things happen. In April 1995, Timothy McVeigh and who knows who else, Terry Nichols, other people we'll maybe never know, blow up the federal building in Oklahoma City, killing, well over 100 people, including many children. And that supercharges the discussion on whether the United States should be designating terrorism organizations, designating terrorist groups. And also within that period, there's a series of, especially from January through March, late January through early March of 1996, in our region more generally, Hamas and the Islamic Jihad blow up a whole bunch of buses. Their argument was they were responding to the Israelis' decision to kill during a relative lull the one of the main kind of operatives of Hamas's military wing, a guy called Yahya Ayyash, the engineer. So Rabin has also been assassinated in November 1995. So the peace process is kind of, in complete chaos, right? And also there's been this development in the United States. At this point in time, the ADL starts to agitate along with the Israeli government for, it's claiming that Hamas in particular is operating in the United States and raising money under the cover of humanitarian activity. So basically, there's this push in Congress to declare groups as foreign terrorist organizations or groups as terrorist organizations. So there's talk about foreign and domestic, because remember the McVeigh thing, the Oklahoma City attack, purely domestic act, even though a so-called terrorism expert by the name of Stephen Emerson at the time tried to claim it bore all the hallmarks of Middle Eastern terrorism. So at this point, Congress is in motion and finally takes action, I think in March 1996 or April 1996.
Shepherded along, obviously, by the ADL and AIPAC and all the rest.
Well, that's, I said the ADL spearheaded this, along with the Israeli government also was very anxious that this law be passed. So basically, in the context of a massive, what is known as omnibus crime bill called the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. For fans of acronyms, which I don't use, but I will for this, it's called ADPA. The Congress passes this omnibus act where, and in addition, there's a kind of the last of the major immigration reform acts is passed then, also very harsh. But the combination of these bills basically creates a whole new basis for criminal liability. So it authorizes the Secretary of State in their sole discretion to designate foreign terrorist organizations. And this designation is made on the basis of three findings. One is the group is foreign, two, it engages in terrorist activity, and three, that terrorist activity impacts the national security of the United States or the security of United States nationals. National security includes things like the foreign interest relations of the United States. So a famous example is the Kurdistan Workers' Party gets designated as a terrorist organization because the United States at the time is a strong ally of Turkey. As we know, the U.S. has many interests in working with the Kurdistan Workers' Party and, in fact, is openly allied with it in Syria. But for official purposes, it's designated as a foreign terrorist organization. this is not something that these designations are not something that anyone can challenge in court. Once the Secretary of State has made their determination, only they can revoke it, right? Only the Secretary of State can revoke it. It's not something you can ask a court to look into. So, as a result of a designation as a foreign terrorist organization, someone can be charged now, this new law says, with providing what is known as material support. So in the past, before this law, the only way someone could be prosecuted for any type of terrorism charge would be a charge that's directly related to violent activity. There's been an attack, someone's been caught, and then they get put on trial for, murder abroad, attacking, American, killing, an attack in which leads to the death of American personnel, American citizens, destroying federal property, whatever it is, airplane hijacking. Now you don't need an attack. The only thing that's criminalized is support. Okay. So that's meant to get at this purported problem of foreign terrorist organizations supposedly raising money for their charitable activity, or raising money for their groups under the cover of charitable activity, on the theory, and Congress made all these findings, that money is fungible. And so money for, orphans and children and food aid frees up money for weapons. Okay. This is exactly the model for the so-called terrorist organization is the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas. That's the model that they're basically using. And the problem is that material support is not just limited to money and weapons and things like this. And there are lots of problems, and the law gets litigated. Ultimately, most of the issues are resolved in favor of the government. But essentially, the issue is that now it's not just material support in the form of money and weapons, but also it gets expanded to things like, if you want to offer yourself as an expert, you want to provide a service, you want to provide speech, you want to talk to a terrorist organization about how to be more peaceful. By 2010, the Supreme Court decides material support in the form of speech can be criminalized. So we now have this new law, and the penalty, by the way, is 20 years in prison for violating this law. So you have this new law where the criminal act is not a criminal act per se, it's support. So in the criminal law, it's a little weird in the criminal law because, if someone commits a murder and, you give them the gun, but they go and shoot them, right? You can be prosecuted for the murder based on that support, but that support in and of itself is not the criminal activity per se. It's part of a criminal chain. Here, now we're just focusing on the support. So it's a little bit, the support is substantive crime. So in a criminological sense, it's a little, or, a legal sense, it's a little strange. But more importantly, now the support is the crime. And it can include speech and, even trying to do things to make a group more peaceful, etc. The idea is that the terrorist organization is so toxic, so beyond the pale that any dealings with it are, potentially criminal and can be construed.
Actually, to make this more concrete also and bring it right up to the present, you co-authored an article last year, I think it was, about the ADL. For those of our listeners who don't know what the ADL, it's the Anti-Defamation League, which was originally like a Jewish civil rights organization protecting the civil rights of Jews in America, but has since morphed into one of the key constituents of the Israel lobby in Washington. And they're much more concerned now with protecting Israel than taking care of the civil rights of American Jews. But anyway, they have pushed, I don't know where it is now, maybe you can bring us up to date, but the article you wrote was about the ADL pushing for the designation of student organizers to get protesters against the genocide here on American college campuses to be designated or to be found complicit or guilty of material support for terrorism, which is exactly what you're talking about, right? In other words, organizations like SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, on this, what they want, what the ADL wants is to be able to criminalize student protesters against the genocide in Gaza, and not just criminalize them, but connect them to terrorism, which means which involves these arbitrary designations of, well, the Secretary of State said it's terrorist, therefore it's terrorist, and therefore you're guilty. So tell us a little bit about that maneuver by the ADL, specifically with regard to college campuses here in the U.S., because we've talked a lot. Yeah, go on, Kenny.
But they also, just to add to this, the fact that Trump is now in power and he's talking about it, and that from where I sit, I would, one presumably would take it a lot more seriously that this will be implemented somehow.
Well, I think, I don't know. I think Wadie knows more than me. I wouldn't put it past Biden and Blinken and that crew either. I mean, they're not. I don't think they're any worse than. I don't think Trump is any worse than them necessarily.
So the issue is, because it's a criminal. We're now talking about a criminal proposition. The issue becomes, so for someone to be found guilty of providing material support, they have to know that what they're providing is material support, and that they know that what they're providing, and that they know they're providing it to a terrorist, what they know is a terrorist organization. So the issue here becomes, and this was litigated, I had a colleague who litigated this issue in the Larian prosecution. I kind of helped her with the brief a little bit, but, and we had other lawyers on the case who were active on this, but I, played a small role in trying to argue that you can't just have knowledge. It should be specific intent to further the illegal goals of the group, right? The violent goals of the group. Because this was based on, that was an argument based on earlier Supreme Court jurisprudence involving the Communist Party from the 50s and 60s under the Smith Act. This idea that for criminal liability to attach in situations involving speech and political affiliation, there has to be, a greater intent to further the illegal goals of the group. You can't just be, giving, knowing that you're giving money to a group distributing food aid just because they happen to be classified as a terrorist organization. That's not enough to be criminally liable. Because also in the United States, a further kind of twist on this is, you are legally allowed to be a member of a terrorist organization. You can't provide, I wouldn't suggest it. And, you can't do literally anything other than maybe say that. And even then you'll probably be investigated. But it's legal to be a member of a terrorist organization. You just can't provide any support at all, because it would be construed as material support. So there is no law that says you cannot be a member of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, whatever group. You are allowed to be. It is legal to be a member of a terrorist organization in the United States. But of course, we all know functionally, that's basically, that's an on paper right. That's not a real, as soon as someone says that they're a member of ISIS, they're going to be investigated, and the government will find a way to prosecute them. But just
like the guy in New Orleans, for example, right? Allegedly.
Then he carried out a whole bunch of criminal activity. But just saying I'm a member of whatever terrorist organization is not illegal. Just, but like in practical terms, it's not legal.
But what was it that the ADL was trying to do with respect to these student groups? Because that's terrifying.
Basically, so that's why I talk about the legal standards. You have to know what you're providing as material support and know that you're providing it to a terrorist organization. So the ADL was trying to articulate a theory that somehow, by being active on behalf of SJP or whomever, these students were providing material support to a foreign terrorist organization. So the support, I suppose, would be in the form of demonstrating and advocating for them, because we now know that material support in the form of speech can be criminalized, although, it would probably have to come under the guise of material support as a service, or maybe in the form of personnel, which are terms that, material support involves, services or personnel. But because it's not necessarily clear that that's any expert advice or assistance, which is a little bit more defined. So it's very vague legally as a kind of what kind of support that is. I'm not really clear on it. A, B, do they know that they're providing support to a terrorist organization? Well, for material support in the form of speech to be allowed, the Supreme Court said it has to be done in conjunction with the terrorist group or at the behest of a terrorist group or in coordination with, something like that. So independent advocacy, the Supreme Court said, this was in this 2010 case called Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project. Independent advocacy remains legal, remains legitimate. So you can, so a person can advocate in their individual capacity for any terrorist organization on the list as much as they like, as long as it's independent. Now,
well, yeah, sorry. Does that mean that if one were to appear on, let's say, Hezbollah television station, would that be legal or illegal according to U.S. law?
So this is something I've thought about. I think it's a gray area. I think if you had ultimately I'd think no, but again, A, I'm not offering legal advice. B, it all depends on the zealousy of the prosecutor. Prosecutors have in our society, virtually unreviewable discretion to charge people with things if they believe there's a factual predicate. So if someone were to appear on El Manar television or whatever, depending on what they said and how they said it, it could open up the possibility of a material support charge. But in the case of the students, right, as far as we can tell, they don't seem to be in coordination or in contact with any foreign terrorist organizations. This is a harassment tactic because the ADL knows very well that the FBI can open up an investigation on a very, very, very limited factual predicate, limited factual grounds. And an investigation can be quite intrusive and involve violations of an individual's privacy and the potential for discovering evidence of other criminal activity, right? The famous example in the Palestinian context is the investigation in the Chicago area of Palestinian rights advocates, which then it didn't lead to any terrorism charges because they were investigated on their links to so-called terrorist organizations. But in the end, it only led to the prosecution of a community organizer named Rasmia Ode, who had her citizenship stripped and then she was deported, right? That was the result of one of these kind of trumped up investigations into purported terrorism links that, of course, were not real. The problem is also the ADL understands that independent advocacy versus advocacy on behalf of a group or in coordination with the group or at the behest of a group, these are terms that in one court case, in the First Circuit, the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit in Boston, they talked about these concepts being unelaborated. So the ADL also knows that it's operating in an area or in a situation where there's a lot of gray area. So it's kind of what I would call a kind of a plea or a call for heightened investigatory activity of a harassing nature for these activists.
In other words, a form of intimidation.
They know.
That's basically a form of intimidation, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think when the FBI gets involved in any matter, you have to take it extremely seriously.
Yeah,
right.
We might even refer to it as a form of terrorism, even if it's not a legal definition. It goes back to the original definition of the term, basically, right? Karim, you were going to ask something, and then we can wrap.
And no, I think that just that there was a recent, I mean, just for my purposes, there was a recent case. I don't know if Wadie knows about it, but the Knight Institute at Columbia University and the foundation that basically challenged the Biden administration about whether, for example, in a country like Lebanon, you could simply meet with those that are designated as terrorists, whether it's Hezbollah or whoever it is, and that you could actually just meet with them by way of having an interview or having a seminar or a discussion, something like that, that was previously prohibited, and they won that case as a way, as I understand it, in the sense that it's because you're not actually, the definition of materially aiding or supporting this group is obviously not simply through a discussion or a seminar with students kind of thing. That seems to have, I mean, unless I misunderstood the case.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think the issue with this case is, on the one hand, so it's the Biden administration that agreed to this. So if the Trump administration wants to change its policy and kind of, reopen this, who knows what will happen. B, I think there's a real difference between if I, Wadie Said, or you, Karim Muqdasi, or any one of us who were to appear on El Manar television versus, Johnny Come Lately, right, from Topeka, Kansas. Like, I think that the racial dynamics do say something here, right? I think that, if a journalist, and then there's also, remember, the Assange precedent is very dangerous here too, because there's you remember Assange, the government here in the United States continually insisted that Assange was not a journalist, right? And so, yes, this is a welcome development, but, also it's not without limits. The other thing I just wanted to make clear was, because I don't think it's such a long-winded discussion on the terrorism thing, and I apologize for that, but some of the critical things were that in 1996, when Congress passed this law about, declaring material support to foreign terrorist organizations illegal, and it created this category of foreign terrorist organizations, there was no corresponding list of domestic terrorist organizations, right? So even though one of the catalysts for this law was the Oklahoma City attack, didn't lead to a designation of domestic groups. B, what's also, I think, of a great deal of importance in having this discussion is there are all sorts of sub-criminal or non-material support knock-on effects. So when we talked about, Karim mentioned Julani, Ahmed al-Shara, the new, whatever he is, leader of Syria, who's I guess a former founder of the Islamic State movement, Islamic State organization, which, is quite something, and had until recently a kind of a price on his head, so to speak, a U.S. price on his head. I think they took it away. Yeah. But maybe, I'm not sure about that. But there's a whole also category, and now this number is much, much bigger. So the number of foreign terrorist organizations is, it's now maybe around 60, 70. When the list first came out, there were about maybe 30 groups. About a third of them were either Palestinian and, or Hezbollah. So at the time the first list came out in 1997, the United States was basically on the record as saying that like 30% to 1/3 of all terrorism in the world, or all terrorist groups in the world, are either Palestinian or Hezbollah. So now it's expanded, and it's mostly focused on what the government deems jihadist organizations. I pronounced it, of course.
Except the ones they have dealings with, obviously.
Well,
I mean, it's so offensive intellectually, politically, morally, ethically speaking. It's so offensive. This thing of, boom, you're a terrorist. Boom, you're not a terrorist. Like Trump
has just designated gangs and people coming from Mexico and things like this now as terrorists.
Well, that's going to be a big issue, because there was a case from several years ago in the highest court in New York, the Court of Appeals, where they construed New York's anti-terrorism law to be unconstitutional, like, in the New York Constitution, like a state constitution, because it purported to include criminal gangs. And it said, look, you can't, like, you can say what you want, but criminal gangs are not operating for political gain, right? They're operating for personal gain, pecuniary gain, whatever it is, but they're not out there harming civilians to overthrow the government. So that's going to be interesting to see. But there's also been this whole class of kind of sub foreign terrorist organization designations that are made by the Treasury Department, and this ties into the whole sanctions regime. So, there's a vast sprawling complex housed in the Office of Foreign Assets Control in the Department of the Treasury that's, designates individuals as connected to terrorism and basically cuts off dealings of U.S. persons and entities from them, to the point where, they're essentially not able to get a credit card or use the international banking system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So,
in fact, if we invited you to AUB, we'd have to pass you through that. You'd have to be vetted through that system. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to give a talk at AUB.
Yeah.
This is a good place to wrap, Wadie. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It was not relax. It's amazing. I mean, like the depths of depravity. I mean, it's just just for all of us as intellectuals, first of all, not to mention as people with ethical compasses, it's just it's so offensive. It's so galling that some guy could just go ping and pong. Now you're a terrorist. Now you're not a terrorist. Or I decide you're a terrorist. Or if you bother me, therefore I'm going to. It's like, it just seemed like this. We're supposed to be living in a nation of laws. It ends up being, as usual, a nation of arbitrariness.
Well, that's the thing, is that I think all of us grew up in a time where we were, we recognized the criticisms, we had our criticisms, we were deeply skeptical, et cetera. But there was a sense that, if we were able to make the argument, and if it were able to come to light, people couldn't deny reality, and they would change how, and I think that's been blown up.
We live in the era of what our friend Hassan Haj calls alternate realities, where there's totally different.
Yeah. I remember saying that a lot. When I would.
It's unbelievable. It's not just denial now. We're at a whole new level of, what was that? Do you remember the horrible spokesperson for Trump in his first administration, Kellyanne Conway? Remember, she came up with that killer line that was something. She was spouting things that were like factually just wrong, and she said, "Well, we have alternate truths," or something. She said something like that. It wasn't just alternate realities, but we have alternate.
Well, as opposed to the guy of the State Department,
as opposed to Count Dracula,
as opposed to
the State Department guy and the
Count
other
Dracula,
guy. Come on,
Biden's guy.
Yeah.
You remember Bush, but W. Bush said it too. You remember he said, "We're not going to deal." He's like, "I've got two constituents. I got the fact-based community, and I got the the faith-based community. I'm going to go with my gut."
Neither fact nor faith, basically.
Okay,
thank you, Wadie, so much.
Okay,
thanks,
thank
Wadie.
you.